Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second part two of our Budget 101 series that both Maureen and I have had some past experiences conducting, and so we're really excited to be able to present this background information to you, which is really sort of the fundamentals that go into budget development. And the reason that we both feel this is so important is that, you know, when we have our formal budget presentations, which start officially in February, so February is the time that across the state of New York, every school district is basically presenting the same kind of information. And so in following the same kind of timeline, marching towards that May vote. So all this information is pretty standardized. And so what we felt was that when anyone comes to those formal budget presentations, this is the information that you don't get, because this is all the background, and this is really all the fundamentals that really make all of that presentation starting in February make any sense whatsoever. So we thought it would be important to kind of use this as sort of an opportunity to just, break down some of the details and also give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. And before we get into this, just as a tiny bit of a review of the last Budget 101, because they are all sort of scaffolded and built upon each other. We talked about some major budget factors that impact, any kind of budget development, and that would be collective bargaining agreements. And we've mentioned that the school districts may not see themselves as a service industry, but we are a service industry because it's the people who do the work. We do that work around educating children in all sort of roles in the district. Pensions, the pensions being the teachers' retirement system, which is all for certificated employees, teachers and administrators, and the non-certificated, which would be the employee retirement system, which is all other employees that don't fall under the TRS category. And every person working in a school district, it does fall under a contract. So that's why that's a major part of budget development. Obviously, FICA, workman's comp, health care, all of those are major factors that we have to consider. Enrollment and class size we talked about, the pension costs, the health care, all the state mandates, capital projects and debt and so forth. And that it's a real balancing act to kind of make all this sort of, at the end, result in a budget that can be presented to the Board of Education for adoption. So there are a lot of steps that go into that. And we wanted to use tonight's 101 to really get into some of the more complex, esoteric elements in budget development, which are things that we don't you may not think exist, such as talking about revenues. Like, who would talk about revenues for a school district? What are we doing to get revenues? There are revenues that come in, not a whole lot, but we do have, that is a part or factor that's very important in this. So we'll get started with getting into what's organized for tonight's presentation, which is a look at state aid, which is a very huge part of the conversation, tax levy or tax cap, and other revenue sources.
Sure. So tonight, we just really thought it was important to kind of go over one of the topics that we're going to be speaking about is state aid, and that's one of the major funding resources outside of our local tax dollars, and how and just kind of give you some sense of how the state operates and what some of those in the beginning. We just speak about there's three different times with the budget. The budget, there's an executive proposal that is that the governor puts out and basically spells out his spending plan for the year. And at that time, the legislator body, they get an opportunity to look at it, and basically from that time in January until it's finally enacted in April, they go back and forth and try to, for the most part, get money back into the educational budget that the governor initially puts before them. And at that time, like myself and I know Valor, we meet with local legislators and tell them our priorities for the year, and we look at what the governor is proposing, and some of it isn't always so much in dollars. It may be a change in how things are funded, and we then speak to the challenges they would present for us. So we are constantly in communication with our local people who represent all of Westchester, but our local legislators. because it is really important for them, because some things may seem as though, like just certain wording and different changes that could be very problematic for districts, especially in Lower Westchester, and each group in local areas are always, trying to fight for the same dollar. So it's a really important piece that goes on.
It is, that legislative piece, because last week it was Sylvia Allison and I who went to a Westchester Putnam School Boards Association meeting, which was all about advocacy and how important it is. This very thing that Maureen mentioned, that we've got to, no matter what, what the sort of demographics are of your school district, you have to tell your own story, and you have to make sure that your local legislators have a face with, with your school district. And one of the things that they recommended, which, is something that, we have on our agenda to talk about in January, is this notion of inviting our legislators to the school district, to come and see, what we do in Hastings, to have a conversation with our students, walk around the building. But that's advocacy. You may not think it is, but it is advocacy. And so, and that's so important. And it may not be that, the issue like foundation aid, that's ever going to be something that we get back. But guess what? When they're voting for something very important, the experience that they had in Hastings will make a difference. I mean, that's something that they have in mind, or if they have any of that bullet money left over. So after all the money has been dispersed, there's some money left over. I mean, sometimes it's 10,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000. It should come our way. And that's why that advocacy and face-to-face is so, so critical.
Yes, because many of the things that the governor, especially in terms of the lower Hudson Valley, Hudson region, we get such few state dollars, and even any type of change to the formula or anything that they're proposing really has like some really devastating effects to us. And even things that may not seem that as problematic even to the legislators, like they look to us, and we get an opportunity to go through, like my colleagues and myself and Valerie and the superintendents, we go through the proposals, and then we mark up what those things would mean, locally. And again, it's as much as it seems old-fashioned, the loudest voices, I mean, it's really important. And even they're always saying to us, make sure you're speaking to your taxpayers, because really that's what matters. When they don't hear from people and they're not, as much as I can say it, but it's really important for them to hear, Tom Abenante, locally, who's the local councilman. He says when he doesn't hear from people, that, he's just assuming it's not a problem.
Exactly.
So I think it's, definitely something we'll be speaking about as we see what those different proposals are. But it is important, and it's something we're actively as a local group involved in. Tax levy. Tax levy is the amount that comes from local tax dollars. That's the amount we levy with our in Hastings schools to balance our budget. And that dollar amount comes from when you subtract all other revenues, including state aid, and what the balance of those dollars is needed to balance our budget. And that's the tax levy. And that levy determines how our local homeowners and business owners will be taxed within the school boundary. Other revenues we'll speak on tonight, just to kind of give you a sense where some of our other dollars come in. We have out-of-district tuitions, borderline properties, which I would argue is not really a revenue, but just getting money that is our money from other communities that we have their students in our boundaries. Sales tax. We have some interfund transfers. I'll explain that. And that's really just monies coming from some of the district's reserve funds. We also have interest income, refunds, and other non-recurring miscellaneous revenues. As you can see here, I mean, we do try to maximize different things. The last couple of years, we've had many rental of our space for filming purposes and things like that. So where the opportunities, when they exist, and different rentals of the facilities, we do try to maximize those opportunities if they make sense to us and we can host it. And but other than that, we do have limited control over some of these revenue sources.
And we appreciated that the state gave us the additional sales tax refund.
Yeah, well, in the Westchester County, I mean, although it was difficult, the George Latimer last year had proposed to increase the local sales tax, and that was making it on par with Yonkers and New York City and things like that. It was actually, I think it's still slightly less, but that really was a significant increase for us alone. It's going to generate another $150,000 worth of revenue year over year, which is significant on what we receive. So although I think there was some concern about at looking at, if that would hurt, any type of business, but I think in the analysis, it was a smart move because, again, the county, in looking at their limited resources, they did put that forth and really for the benefit of schools, and that has benefited all of us. So.
It does. And in at the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association advocacy group, it was one of the sort of recommendations was that we should school districts should write a letter of thanks to to Mr. Latimer to thank because that is a gift that is going to continue to sort of give every year, and that's $150,000 is no small amount of money in a school budget, and so that's another part of the advocacy sort of strategy, is that it's not just us who will thank or invite or Ms. Szymanski a legislator, but it's the community, and so there's a whole Westchester Putnam School Boards Association advocacy kit. So they're resolutions, but they're also like letters, that you can, just sign and send. And I strongly suggest that we do that, especially around, the good things. I mean, there are things that we're certainly not going to always like, but they need to hear from us certainly when there are good things that take place, and that would be certainly one of the categories.
Yeah, and sales tax, as we know, I mean, unlike other taxes, it's based upon your own actual spending. So it is one of I think there's a fairness to it as opposed to just levying like additional local taxes on homeowners or income tax. I think sales tax is driven by your own spending. So I think that was one that I think did make sense for us. This infographics here, all it really is just kind of demonstrating is the challenge in terms of the ability to balance our budget each year and the challenges with having the tax cap and the limited amount of resources that we're really able to, of revenues that we're able to generate. So as you can see here, that New York State does control a large part of the revenue budget, because part of it is also the tax levies and how much money they give toward local municipalities and things that impact us. So again, it does go back to that, speaking about advocacy and how important it is for us to be very involved in that, because there's a lot of other things, if we're not advocating for the state, then we then are impacted by it. So this is just kind of just demonstrating the challenge in balancing our budgets each year.
And I don't think that the average community member anywhere in New York State really sort of was aware of this 95% sort of balance, that 95% in terms of regulation, what we can and can't do, what's a reserve, what's not a reserve, what you can take out of your fund balance. All of those things are highly regulated. We don't there's very little that we can do that will impact that number. I mean, we have to be certainly very thoughtful and strategic in our choices around the things that we do have control over, but 5% coming from meager revenue sources, it's not like we're going to have like some major commercial entity move into Hastings. We're not. That's the way you would get more revenue. That's not going to happen. So it does unfortunately become a fairly significant responsibility of the taxpayer.
So this just is something we always show this as part of our budget presentation, and this reflects last year's final budget numbers. And it kind of just, again, it groups some of these things together, and we'll speak a little bit about miscellaneous receipts and revenues later. But really, this is the way the state requires us to report it out in 4 major categories. And as you can see, our state aid numbers a little bit over $5 million. We have miscellaneous revenues of close to $1.2 million. The other is coming from our appropriated fund balance, which is a combination of savings generated from the previous year's budget and other savings that the district may have had on hand by putting money away in like rainy day funds. So as Valerie spoke about that's where we have some control. But again, though we are limited to how much we can keep in each type of reserve and how that money is used. And then again, we spoke about this last week, the bulk of our budget is financed by our local property owners, and that is, last year it was $42.5 million. This includes the STAR refunds. The way that works is we actually receive in taxes about $4 million less than that, and then the rest comes to us via STAR, like the STAR refunds that people are getting. But that's our overall tax levy, and we can see that for the most part, as you can see, the 83% plus the 10% from the state, and then the sales tax and some of those others are also state revenues. That accounts for about 95% of our budget. And then the rest is kind of in those other categories, as we spoke about. This is just kind of goes in, so we receive, as we mentioned, about 10% of our total revenues from the state. And just so you know how this compares, we spoke about this a little bit last week. I mean, other districts in upstate New York, they're receiving about 70% or 80% of their funding from the state. So it's like downstate. Many of our neighbors are in this same kind of percentage. Some are even receiving less. And then, you know, some of the more high needs districts in Westchester do receive more, but it's a very, very small amount. The majority of the money in the state of New York goes to the big 5 school districts, which include Yonkers. And Yonkers actually doesn't even really get that much compared to like Syracuse,
New York City,
Binghamton.
Syracuse,
Binghamton.
Rochester, Buffalo.
Yeah, and Binghamton.
And
Oh, no, not Binghamton.
Utica's another one. So it's really
Yeah.
a big 7.
Yeah.
So that number keeps growing, and that's where the money is going to, you know, that and Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare spending.
And so, you know, it's almost impossible. I mean, and we can, you know, talk a lot about foundation aid, but it's never coming back to districts in Westchester.
Right.
It just isn't, because it is going to those school districts that have a greater needs around, you know, the numbers of children, you know, whose first language may not be English, or students who need other, you know, sources, types of mandated services. The other tricky part of this foundation aid formula is the fact that it's used as like the 2010 census.
Yeah, we're going to get into that because the state hasn't been able to make good on the funding of that. But in terms of just this particular breakdown, it just shows that within that 10%, there's other things beyond foundation aid. Foundation aid is the general aid that funds the schools, and then there are other aids that are expense-driven aids. So building aid is only generated if you spend money, such as the bond that we're doing. That money is a component of state aid, and that's how we get the dollars back. BOCES aid, we're going to speak a little bit about that later, but BOCES aid is driven by our expenditures with BOCES, which if we spend a certain amount of money, we receive money back in the following year. And again, these are things that the governor a couple years ago had talked about capping, so that would be problematic. That would mean even if you were to spend more, you wouldn't get back that proportionate aid. And then there's textbooks and library and other things that we receive, and we'll speak to that later. We get a certain amount allocated every year, and we get funds back when we spend those dollars.
And what an interesting graphic.
Yes.
I mean, and one of the backstories to this is, you know, there's something that, you know, we probably, just because we're tired of ever, you know, saying it again, there are quite a number of unfunded mandates. You know, these are things that we have to do, no matter whether you have the revenue available or whatever it is that you're doing, you know, to try to make sure you manage, the budget as best as you can and minimize the impact on the public. There are always things that we are forced to do that have no funding attached to them. And that happens fairly regularly every year in New York State, to the point where it's just, I think we all just kind of sort of breathe deeply and try to kind of, deal with it, because we know that there's no funding associated with any of these things. And it's not to say that they're not things that are not important, but we need we need the resources. I mean, safety is one of them. There's no question that we need, our front doors, guarded, and we need that, security in each of our buildings, and we need to make sure that there are cameras, and we have, all the resources available to do that well. However, there's no funding that comes with that. Yeah. And the state's, pretty clear around the kinds of things that we have to do, the number of drills we do, and all of the components that, as I said, are really important, but they don't necessarily come with additional dollars, and that is another burden for the district, therefore to the taxpayers.
Yes, I mean, just on the safety, I was just thinking about the numbers. I mean, prior to all the changes, which I would agree, most of us would agree that even if the state didn't mandate it, it would be something we'd be thinking about doing. But just our spending between our security team and our consultants and things that are needed to help us with our security plans, and it's very I mean, it's very involved now, and you really need to, an expert. We spend almost close to $350,000 a year just on that. And that was something 10 years ago we didn't.
You didn't have.
That wasn't part of our budget. So as all these kind of things come up, you know, it's significant, and arguably, we could probably spend more. Like, that's kind of doing at the, would not be, you know, we would love to have more security, but we work with what we have.
Exactly.
It's expensive. So foundation aid factors. So each amount of money we get from the state, it's a very long formula, and they take a lot of inputs to come up with how many dollars each district will receive. And as you can see at the bottom here, there's 94 lines in this calculation. So it's not just like two things and you multiply.
It's not meant to be understood.
It's not meant to be understood. And if you look through it, I mean, a lot of it is kind of repetitive too, but there's many things that come in. But the things that really dictate how much money you get, and this is really what is the drivers of foundation aid, adjusted gross income of any place, but in this case, Hastings-on-Hudson residents. That comes directly when you put that little ID number on your tax forms. That's where that information comes from. So in looking to see how much money we should receive, they take the adjusted gross income of each resident. They take the property values, again, what comes from the New York State Department of Taxation. It's probably a few years behind always that data because it's never going to be, you know, as up to date, which may be better for us. Total square miles of the town, poverty count, again, off of, they obviously have all that information available to them through U.S. Census data and also other direct certifications of people receiving assistance, and then they take our enrollment. Basically, that's what drives our number. And the two things that are probably the reason we get so, I mean, everything on here would not drive a lot of money toward the district. So to Valerie's point, I mean, I think this is the challenge, and there is some, it makes sense in some ways somehow, but they don't count in the cost of living in the area, and that's always the argument that, yes, you know, high property values, high gross income, but again, there's not, the adjustment factor for the cost of living is just what I think is lacking and what makes the formula itself problematic.
Mm-hmm. And that's something, you know, that, you know, communities in Westchester, you know, and like Hastings, need to pay attention to, because we're not going to get any more foundation aid. We're not going to get any more money because it's already going to, you know, the big seven, and it's going to Medicare. So at the same time, we're in a service industry. Contracts are going to increase, you know, every year. And the cost of doing business, you know, not only, you know, employee contracts and benefits, it's also any contract, you know, for equipment and any other service. It goes up every year, or at least goes up at some amount. So that, you know, there's no such thing as sort of like standing still, you know, and we have to consider the ways in which, you know, our advocacy points out to, you know, our legislators, you know, how much more does does the general public and the taxpayer have to bear here? You know, at what point then, you know, do we end up like other school districts having to reduce our staff? Because we can't keep on, you know, we're not going to get any more, you know, additional revenue, right? You know, that's pretty clear. You know, those sources are not going to sort of grow over time. You know, to spend more at BOCES to get aid, you know, that is not necessary. We spend what we need, not to spend to get the you know, the reimbursement. And the borderline taxes, those are things that are just sort of like not the big money. And so we really have to think about advocacy and working with one district in particular that we learned about at the advocacy workshop, which is Ossining, which has done a lot of work. There, you know, different sorts of issues, but you know, the superintendent and the board president have done an amazing amount of work, and I think school districts, you know, can learn from it. And we certainly are going to, you know, take a little field trip and go there and hear, you know, what they've been doing, because this is really important, you know, to us. You know, this is important to us. So, you know, there may be the sense that, you know, districts like Hastings can take care of and don't, you know, we don't need to worry about them. I think that's a real fallacy, and I think there has to be, you know, some work towards really messaging, sending a message that it isn't that, we're going to just, the taxpayers are just going to sort of absorb things, but that we have to put forward, realistically, how is it possible for us to absorb all these unfunded mandates without any increased resources from the state?
So this, I mean, even though I agree, there's probably a great unlikelihood we'll ever see this money. Oh, goodness, sorry. The foundation aid. So the foundation aid, the formula came into play when New York City had sued the state about the equity of funding, and I can't remember now the exact, there was a name about that actual, what was brought forth, and that was prior to the recession, and at the time, the state agreed that the funding, and that's where the foundation aid kind of came, that the formula was not running correctly, so at that time it was recalibrated, and basically it was great because districts like Hastings, based upon some different factors in the foundation aid, would be receiving a lot more money. So unfortunately, at the same time when that happened, the fiscal equity, and we were actually would have benefited like New York City and received more aid, because believe it or not, there's places in Long Island and other places that receive a lot more aid that it's not really clear why, but there's some things that we get kind of grouped in with New York City, and there's different factors that that affected the way we were being funded. So unfortunately, the foundation aid, they kind of froze it. So in other words, although they show you every year what you would receive under the actual law, they don't have the money to fund it. So this is actually a true number, that if had the state not had the issues, I mean, it's at least $600,000 for this year. And over the course of 7 or 8 years, it's over $5 million. Now, at the same time when there's many districts, I know Eastchester actually I think is 1.3 million each year that they're receiving less, but there are districts in Westchester that are actually receiving more. And that's where you talk about the advocacy. I'm like, I feel bad for them, but they're like, well, if they switch it, then they'll get less. And I'm like, okay, I'm okay with that. But they're like unable, right now there's districts that are actually being underfunded and districts that are being overfunded. So these are kind of things that every year when the legislators come, we speak to them, but because it affects people in different ways, and again, we can't, but it's something, especially districts who are on the, we're not on the receiving end of the extra money, we do always bring this to our local legislators and saying, okay, well, even if there's a way to either, get us some of that money, because it is a significant dollar amount, and then why have the formula if you're not going to fund us correctly? So
right, and therein lies, sort of the reality that we need to figure out a different message. We can keep asking for this. Mm-hmm. The reality is we're not going to get it. Right. And that we need to figure out, like, then what is the message when we do have an audience with legislators that really is more realistic for us. Mm-hmm. What is that thing? And that's the exciting part of kind of thinking about this, because this is frustrating when you look at this and see, this is money that we could have gotten, but we were never going to see. It's not something that we can do anything about. But focusing on some kind of advocacy message would be the way to go. Mm-hmm.
Now, within the foundation aid also, and these are other items that drive aid to the school that are kind of separate, and they get added to your foundation aid. So there's aids called excess cost aids, and both of these type of aids are driven by expenditures in the special education, either in district or out of district. And the way that how they work the formula is that if but the reason it's important is I think sometimes people see the expenditures on the special education side of the budget, but those expenditures also drive revenues in forms of aids and reimbursements that are captured within the money we receive back in state aid. So for children that would be in a private excess cost, so if they are in a private school placement that the district places them in, I actually added something, but I guess Patrick didn't get the most recent. We receive back 77% on the allowable cost. So we have to contribute the first like $26,000. So if the tuition in the private school would be $45,000, we're required to pay the first $26,000, and then after that, the $20,000 less, is then funded at 77% reimbursement to the district. And then with the public, which is a public school placement, after our contribution level is a little bit higher, and I'll tell you the reason why those are different, we have to pay the first $61,000 of the tuition or expense And that's all expenses, and obviously a lot of times it exceeds that. And then after that, anything up and above that, the district receives 25% back in form of reimbursement. The reason those two percentages in the contribution levels vary so significantly, private schools are much cheaper. So I think the state actually, interestingly, although they kind of want us to push, I think there's some type of motivation to put kids in private placements because it's cheaper for them to fund. So that would be like a private would be like a Devereaux or something like that, Eagle Hill or something, although we don't place there, but and a public would be like Ardsley if we place a child there. But again, by having children out of district, there is money that is also, like, which you don't see on the expenditure side of the budget, we do get funds back for those students. And again, yeah, there's some exclusions, again, 25 lines to that calculation.
Yeah, okay, and then building aid.
So building aid factors. So building aid, as we spoke about before, and most people are probably somewhat more familiar with this one because we spoke about this a lot when we were doing our bond last year. When districts do those type of projects that are voter approved, larger scale capital improvement projects, if in fact it is approved by voters and meets with the state guidelines, which we do before, we make sure that it does fit with, you can't just build something that, like we couldn't build like a planetarium down in Reynolds and ask them to pay for it. It has to fit within a school need that's identified. If in fact we then get approval from our voters, those projects are aidable. Our aid ratio is 42.4%. That's what we receive back on whatever money we allowable construction project costs. And again, it's paid back over the probable use of life for the new space or the renovated space, and takes into account pupil capacity and the statewide average interest rate, meaning that they look to see what the borrowing rates are, and they would pay you in line with that. They're typically like 2.5%. They'll reimburse you up into that. If for some reason you borrowed at some higher rate, you may lose some of that. But again, this is a really good thing for schools and probably for the state. I'm sure they do it because it generates business in the state of New York, so it goes back into the state coffers too. So this is something I think the state has put a good bit amount of money, and they've kind of stayed with this commitment to help schools and the infrastructure, especially in lower Westchester County, where a lot of the schools are older, like ours, and are in need of a lot of repair. So we actually receive a very favorable building aid ratio, much higher than most of our schools that we typically compare ourselves to. I think we're definitely the highest in the Quad Village, and I think, like, as an example, Bronxville only gets maybe, I think, 18%. So, we are, that's a very favorable rate, and because of that, it helps us when we do need to tackle a large-scale project. Mm-hmm. Sure. It's funny, Steve, that rate was based upon a lot of rates at the state level, and you'll see that when we show a couple other rates, when we go through, you'll notice we're going to talk about BOCES rate, and interesting, I was just looking at some of the comparisons. A lot of the percentages were like established in like the 80s or 70s, and they have not touched those. And again, it may go back to, like, although there may be some reason for them, the state kind of like, just like the foundation aid, like, even though we're not on the great end of that, they don't want to, like, it'll change for a lot of people. So those have kind of stayed true. And again, we do receive, and we have not heard, that's been one of those areas that there hasn't been talk about recalibrating that in the last couple of years. So, it always could, I guess, but, we once they lock in whatever project we have approved, they would have to, like, fulfill that promise, mm-hmm. even if they were to change in the mm-hmm. future.
And it could certainly be as high in some districts. My former district, I think it was like almost a 55% building aid ratio, somewhere in that neck of the woods, maybe 52, 53. But, and again, it is, as you said, who knows what all the elements are in those 42 lines, but, probably, wealth is somewhat of a factor.
So just to touch on, this seems a little bit out of place, but as we speak about taxes and people's bills, and I just thought it was important to just, if many people maybe understand how this works, but especially in recent years with the town of Greenburgh doing a reassessment, I think, many people people were affected by that and how they saw that come across in their taxes. And sometimes we would get calls and asking us about, like, you know, oh, I thought the budget was only going up this, but they were getting a combination of some of that reassessment. So just to kind of recap, in 2016, the town of Greenburgh conducted a revaluation of all the properties within the town, not only Hastings, obviously, anyone in the town of Greenburgh. On the results of that, and this was pretty consistent with other towns that had to have done reevaluations of their property, what the outcome of the existing properties was 1/3 of the homeowners received an increase. I mean, in some cases fairly substantial. 1/3 actually received a decrease of taxes because they were over, their value of their home was overestimated, and 1/3 remained more or less the same. But at the time, so that phase in and the way the assessment goes, it really affects almost like a year and a half later the taxes. So I think people received the notification, but maybe in the first following year they didn't notice like a big change. So then it was like up until like last year when people really got hit with that final year. Because for some homeowners, there were people that were going to experience like a 30 or 40% increase in their taxes. Actually, Paul Feiner, they had wrote some legislation that got approved that would allow a phase-in of those increases. So just and the reason I have it is because obviously this year there were, for some people, for the first time, they got the full phase-in of that increase. Where the first year they only got 66% of it was exempt, then obviously meaning they paid 33, and then the following year they paid 66, and then the final. But I do think that coupled with other taxes, I think people, when they think of our taxes, we are one taxing entity. You know, people are taxed by many people within our boundaries. They pay county, they pay town, you pay village, and you pay school. And then, of course, then with this kind of phase on top of it. So I think, you know, this affected 1/3 of the people who live here, saw a significant increase in this year's bills that were related, unfortunately, just, you know, solely to their assessed valuation. So that also, as people sometimes will see their individual tax bill, that doesn't always jive up. It's made up of the assessed value, and again, if the assessed value of the town goes down, even if we spend not $1 more, your taxes would also go up because there's a relationship between those two numbers. So, you know, it's important to, as we talk about the budget, when we start getting into our big budget talks, we'll talk about the assessment, and we'll talk about how when our town valuation, if we have an increase in our valuation, how that also is a positive for, you know, others. And then, but just like when that decreases, how even without us spending any more money, your taxes could increase just by the assessment going down. Mm-hmm. And we'll get more into the detail of how that exactly works. But just to remind people that that's a component of when you're thinking about your individual taxes you pay.
Mm-hmm. And the school district has nothing to do with this. Right. There's nothing, we can't be blamed for this one, okay?
And again, this is another thing that we speak about a lot during budget season, and this is just to, when we talk about our reserves and how those kind of savings accounts and how we use some of that money to offset our budgets. And this is just giving you a spreadsheet of, this is from 2016 of our reserve accounts, and giving you a sense of what the district currently has, where we, again, this is an estimated June 20th, that's based upon, you know, where we are today. And again, it's a conservative number. I'm hoping, you know, and to see where, you know, where our reserves are and where we think we're going to be. And I just want to show you, if you kind of looked at the bottom line, and some people say, oh, you're only going to have $7 million, and a couple years ago you had 9.3 or 9.4. A big piece of that change is really in that first line, the tax certiorari. And I spoke about this a little bit last week. Tax certiorari reserve is money set aside to pay back tax certiorari's. And you can, if you have some extra money in it, you can use it to offset your budget, but the main sole purpose of setting up that account is we know we have commercial properties for the most part, not individual homeowners. They filed grievances on their taxes, and this is money that we we know we'll have to pay them back eventually. So a lot of the decrease in our overall total fund balance account has to do with the fact that we've paid back a considerable amount of those liabilities. So it's, you know, it's not so much as that we are in bad shape. It's consistent with where, like, the fact that we, you know, have paid back many of the people we owe. So if you even look from 2016, where we had $2.7 million in that account, we're anticipating having about $800,000 in that account, which is okay. I mean, again, we always want to have money there, but we have a lot less liabilities today because A, we paid back many of them, and B, the reevaluation actually helped with having less tax certiorari. So although it wasn't great for the homeowners, what it did was it went in and reassessed all those commercial properties that may have been overassessed also. So you don't have this constant money that you're going to owe back to people where, we're hoping, I think the idea would be that we would probably not, we always want to have some money there to take care of some liabilities we may have, but that's okay that there's that fluctuation in those two accounts. Like everything else on here, you'll see we have
TRS and ERS,
yeah.
we always have to contribute to that.
Right. And those are reserves where legal, excuse me? So the employee benefit, so those are retired. So again, like Valerie had mentioned before, we're also, you can't just keep as much as you want in these accounts, not that we have all the money to stuff there, but you're only allowed to keep up into a certain dollar amount into those reserves. So the retirement system contribution, that is our ERS, Employee Retirement System Reserve Account. That amount cannot exceed 3 years of liability. Now, that number is less than 3 years of liability, but it could, at no time, even if we had $5 million more, you would not be able to put that there because it would exceed the allowable limit for that account. Right now, our allowable limit is probably somewhere in the $1.9 million range. Again, that's at the highest level. I think in looking at our district and looking at our comparable districts, we've been able to keep somewhere, in that $1 million range consistent. We take some money out, we're able to put some back, and we hope to keep that balance somewhere in around that range. The TRS was one that the governor signed into law last year, which finally allowed us to put funds away for teachers' retirement system. So again, this reserve is limited, and I think last year we could have, at the max, put $300,000 in it. It's based upon a percentage of your overall. It's fairly restrictive, so.
Your overall salaries, right?
Yeah, of salary. So we're, again, we have 200, and again, the balance at the end of the year reflects what we may spend some money this year, but again, no decisions have been made, but just making some educated guesses on there.
And such an important, decision for districts because TRS could vacillate wildly from year to year. 1 year you could have like an 8% decrease. The next year you could have a 16% increase. And if you have no funds, to cover that, and that's could be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1.2, 1.3 million dollars. That difference. And if you don't have the wherewithal to cover that gap, you're going to have to make some terrible decisions, and those terrible decisions mean a reduction in the workforce. So that's a really significant, provides really significant assistance to districts to be able to add some money to offset those wild swings in the teacher's retirement system. ERS is more stable; it doesn't swing that wildly, but TRS just historically has because it's associated or tied to the stock market, and so if that portfolio does super well, we might see the arrow going down in terms of the contribution, but if it goes in the opposite direction over a period of years, and I forget what.
Well, believe it, ERS is actually a higher contribution rate, but for us, we have less employees in it, so we're not as affected by it because we don't have. It's just overall the cost of it is not as significant in terms of salary. I mean, ERS. It's all the employees in the state outside of teachers, so they have their own issues because they have they have firemen, police, and all of those type of people are captured in there. And I think they, again, but both of those systems, to Valerie's point, they are both affected by the way the stock market performs, and they're done on a 5-year rolling average. And if there's one bad year, the stock market, that's when you'll see sometimes the need to increase more significantly than other years. The one thing about the New York State retirement system, it is a fully funded plan, which is actually extremely good for not only everyone who works in it, but also very good for the state's economy in general. And I think it's only like New York and Wisconsin that are fully funded. So I think a lot of states like California, which has a tremendous amount of problems, they borrow from these funds. Which in New York, they're very they're all shored up. I mean, even during the recession, they've been able to keep those fully funded, which again is good because it's in the state coffers and it's money that it's important for not to compromise those funds. So it is a
We want to
strong
draw
system.
from them
Yeah.
when we're,
Yeah.
able to retire,
Yeah.
like 80 or something.
Yes. Yes.
So the reserves and second savings account,
Correct. It does.
so just looking at repairs,
Yep.
future capital projects, so each year the repair amount has been pretty steady.
Yeah, so that amount, we've actually, well, I think it may have been, the first year was established, may have been even the fiscal year before, it may have been June 30th, 15. And that is the same, we haven't taken money out of there. We have put the first contribution in and we've kind of left it there.
So you haven't needed it.
Well, we haven't needed it, well, there were two things. I think we've had repairs that we've been able to take care of our operational budget. And because this requires like a hearing and a little bit differently, we haven't, at this point, we've been able to kind of manage the majority of the repairs within the operational budget. And then if that would be something that if there was a need, you would go through like the hearing to use it.
So what future capital projects
Yes.
have been increasing reserve?
So again, because this is showing from the 15, there was, this fluctuates. There was a time there was $2 million in it, and then it went, we spent some money. And then we, again, as you see when we wrote it down, and that was because in the previous bond, the previous project we did with the fields, we took, I think, 1.7 million out of there. And then we were able to, and then we were left with that 150,000. And then again, as, if we have a year in either which we have, we have a savings, and there's many reasons that sometimes districts end up with having some additional, dollars at the end of the fiscal year, and then the board decided to put the money back, to put some money back in there, and knowing that we would be, having some work to be done.
So you have to spend $1 million in capital projects.
Yes.
Spent, so that figure is going to drop.
Yes.
So you may not need to, in effect, raise tax for that year, but at some point, in order to increase your capital reserve again, it's going to have to come from tax money, correct?
Well, it comes from tax money, not so much as that you don't budget for it. I mean, I guess you can imagine, we have a $52 million spending plan every year. I mean, there's always going to be money, or you hope so, some money left over. And that's how these reserves came to be. Yeah, it doesn't get spent, or you may, like last year when they did the increase in sales tax, for an example, that was something that we already were in our fiscal year, and we actually, the last quarter, we got that increase because they work on a calendar year. The county, we're on a different fiscal. So we got like another $80,000. So that would be like an unexpected, it wasn't that we necessarily generated more taxes, but you have that money left over at the end of the year, you have to do something with it. And that's where I give a recommendation to the board, and I think, there's a lot of thought that goes into what bucket it goes into. So as I had mentioned, there was a time that we were really putting the majority of our extra dollars in that tax cert reserve because we had some really large liabilities on the books. And at that time, we were like, you know what, we would love to put, more in that capital reserve or whatever that year was, but we have to put money away because we know these things are our priority. We want to make sure we pay what we owe to people. And there was a time that, there was a long time that the majority of our money went into that tax cert reserve. As we feel we've addressed that, like as an example, my hope would be at the end of this fiscal year, again, we would be replenishing some money. Again, if again we have a few $100,000 left, I'll be making a recommendation to the board. Where does that go? Does it go into the retirement? Does some of it go to retirement contribution? Does some of it go to that future capital projects? And that's kind of, it was generated from, but at the end, you're always going to have money left over. So it's not as though we put in a line item to intentionally tax people to put it in there.
And actually, it could be as simple as the weather. So you may budget for a certain amount of weather, sort of snow removal, salt, equipment, and so forth, depending on where you are. And we may end up with a milder winter, at which point those dollars are going to go right into one of those reserves. There's going to be a recommendation made to the board. It could be that a school district decides that, we're going to wait another year to adopt a certain, math resource because, maybe there's someone who's retiring and you want to wait and reset. I mean, so there are some pretty, I think rational decisions that go into or that lead to, reductions. And all the budget managers do, look at their budgets when they are, developing them to be as frugal as possible. And then we also are looking at them once they're developed, are there opportunities? We're not just spending out the budget because you have that amount to spend. You're looking for ways to save and recover funds for this very purpose. And it's, and every district, engages in that because that then, helps to, again, build these reserves for, specific purposes that districts need.
I mean, the reality is that with the tax cap, I don't think we'll ever get back to a $10 million just overall reserve, but I think we are mindful and we, whatever money we have left, it's based upon the district's priorities at that time.
And that's a state, the state gives us parameters around what we can, have as fund balance. What is it, about 3%?
Well, on the unassigned only. So the unassigned is no
okay.
more than 4% of your subsequent year's budget. So, and again, this is just a snapshot of where we think we may be. And to your point, Steve, I think, anytime there's any money spent out of these reserves, of course, the board has to kind of look at it and think of, what the priorities are and make decisions based upon, our overall reserves and where we hope to be in the following year.
Mm-hmm. We'll move on. Okay.
So again, this is just, I guess I did insert a couple of things that maybe now going back to the aid factors. So transportation aid. So this is, again, just part of the way our comes through as part of the foundation aid. Again, this all, when we get, it's a separate thing, but when we get our general state aid, this is one of the pieces. And again, this is a expense-driven aid. So, although we do spend quite a bit in transportation, we do, in fact, receive reimbursement, and that comes, again, as part of our state aid package. As you can see, our effective aid ratio is 43.5% on allowable operational costs. So there are some things that, again, it's a 188-line calculation. There are things that when we are providing transportation up and above the state limits, we get less money back on those expenditures. We do receive money back on our out-of-district. So just to kind of give you a few years back, we've looked at sometimes changing how we provide transportation. And I think we have to look at that every year. For sure, I'm talking about out-of-district, some of our out-of-district, not kids we place, but maybe if we have children going to, I'm just using an example like Riverdale Country Day, and we try to be as efficient as possible on some of those more like private school routes. But in fact, the state does, when we look at the analysis to see how much money we can save, part of the reason why we've grappled with making those type of cuts or changing it is because if we put them on a B line, we don't get aid back. But when we do put them on private, we get aid back. So it's like that net cost for us. We're always looking at where we can get efficiencies. But a lot of our in-district transportation is not aidable because it exceeds the state limit. The state limit is 2 miles for kids. And as many of you may know, like districts like Pleasantville, Pelham that are similar in size to the Hastings do not provide in-district transportation at all to their students, only out of district, because you're required to do that. We don't have a choice in doing that. We have a choice sometimes in how we provide that transportation, but not if we do. We have to. So, but again, this just to give you a sense, we do receive back a few $100,000 a year in, or about $300,000 or $400,000 on about, I think, our 1.3 million that we spend. We do get some money back in terms of transportation aid.
And if we owned our own fleet, and we needed to replace buses, we'd get reimbursement on the purchase of buses as well. So we don't have to do that, but if we did, that's also part of this construct.
And transportation, I mean, it's funny that we've looked a few times to see whether we could purchase our own vehicles, but part of the issue is we don't have the facility, and you need to have like garages, and there is some actually like savings in owning your own fleet because the cost of contract and transportation is tremendously expensive. One bus, one small bus, we have to pay, like, no matter how many kids it transports, 1 or 10, it's about $90,000 a year. So I mean, on the small buses, and then the big buses, obviously, they're actually less expensive because you're getting a lot more, but it's extremely expensive. But in fairness, there's, you know, a lot of liability, and they're also a service business, and the people who drive buses are in the union, and, you know, they're transporting children, so they have to receive certain benefits and things like that. But it is, transportation is extremely expensive.
It is. And probably maybe like a, 30-passenger bus might cost $90,000.
Yeah.
So we could buy it outright
Right, exactly.
if we had.
If we had it, we've
had
always
it.
looked at it, I'm like, you know, but
Yeah,
it's.
but there's smaller districts
Yeah.
typically don't, so that
Right.
really isn't something we would do. But just in case, just so that you knew that was part of the equation. BOCES aid is an important part of every school district's budget because we're participating in some shape, form, or fashion. As you know, BOCES is the Board of Cooperative Educational Services that is in New York State. There are 37 BOCES across the state. And I think they came into existence maybe in the 50s, late 40s, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And they exist to provide services to a collection of districts that are supported by a particular BOCES. So the BOCES that supports Hastings and the other, southern, Westchester districts is the Southern Westchester BOCES. There are other BOCES that support Rockland. There's a Rockland BOCES. There's a Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES that supports Putnam County and the Northern Westchester districts. They're all over the place, and we can participate in any number of BOCES. So the service doesn't actually have to be only at the Southern Westchester BOCES. We can participate in a Nassau BOCES,
And we do. Yeah, we do,
a Suffolk BOCES, and we do, an Erie BOCES, and so and on and on and on. And it means that all of those districts, so let's imagine that there are, a certain number of districts, I'm going to make up a number, 18 districts that participate, with a particular BOCES. Those 18 districts have a lot more leverage and bargaining power in negotiating contracts than one district would. And that's really the power of the BOCES, that they can help districts to acquire various services ranging from career and technical education services to a contract to bring in a particular consultant to work specifically in the district. And because other districts are also participating or part of the services offered by that organization or that individual, there's a reduced cost as a result of participation. And so at the end of the year, the BOCES would give the school district funds back for services that range from the aid ratio 55% of the total cost of the contract all the way to 68.3% of the contract. And, that's simple math. You're getting half or over half back for that contract. That is very, very significant and very, very helpful to school districts. And typically, the BOCES is looking at all of the sort of, components associated with that particular service or consultant. They do the appropriate vetting and so forth. Most districts, are the ones that reach out and say, you know what, do you have so-and-so working for you? Do you have a cross-contract with this particular organization or individual? And that's the basis for engaging, in that relationship. And as I mentioned earlier, some of those services are services for our students with disabilities. Some of those services are career and technical education programs that, not only are some of our general education students going, but some of our students who are also receiving mandated services go. And there are a whole range of really superb career and technical education programs that are offered, ranging from culinary, which we learned about at the Southern Westchester BOCES, and at a meeting. So that Westchester Putnam School Boards Association was a dinner. So it was an advocacy meeting that, that happened to, they happened to serve dinner. Who made the dinner? The culinary students. And it was restaurant quality. It was absolutely superb. And those students then, leave that program with a certificate that allows them to go and get a job in that area. So, whether it's automotive to plumbing to, construction trades, those are really important services, to make available to school districts. Because we, even if a particular district, wanted to, to create like a certain program, to study, automotive, engineering, we wouldn't have the facility to actually create that. That's very costly to a school district to pull all that together. So instead of doing that, they rely upon, the various BOCES to make those services available, and that, there's some pretty significant cost savings associated with that.
Yeah, and just to give you a sense of that, last year, I believe we spent close to $2 million with BOCES. And again, the majority, our big spend with BOCES is our technology for the most part, because they actually oversee our technology department, as they do with many districts, so they provide staffing for that department. Again, all our infrastructure, all of our backups, our wireless, our telephone systems, all of those type of items. I'm just giving you an example of one of the larger kind of tickets they run through there. So we had close to $2 million worth of expenditures with BOCES. We received back $983,000 this year. So again, with the effective aid ratio is somewhere between 55 and to 68%. There are exclusions. Again, there's deductions and there's other things in that formula. So on some services, we can, in fact, within that $2 million, we may be getting close to 70% back on that service. There are many times that is, but then in other things like technology and some of the hardware purchases, it may be closer to 50%, and there may be some exclusions. So that's where, and they give us obviously a summary of how they calculate it. And again, on salary. So if we have a person that they put in the district, there's some, when it exceeds over a certain amount of dollars, then the aid they pay on that differs. So, but again, it really, most districts, BOCES exists, the state set it up because they understood, especially in this area where they are all over the state, we couldn't exist. We need them to function, because they do so much for us that we would never be able to have on our own.
We wouldn't.
And they have just a level of expertise. They run everywhere from we need somebody to do our water test. We're mandated to do our lead water testing next year. And again, we secure that through BOCES. And so it runs from there to security to our referees that are at every game, for the Section 1 athletics, all of that. That's about a $90,000 expenditure. Districts could not afford to schedule and manage those type of things. So. And the state incentivizes you. They want us because they look at that as a shared service. People always speak about shared, why are schools? Schools really, that is the ultimate example of a shared service, because it reduces the cost, to Valerie's point, not only for securing the service, which I believe you do get better pricing, because if I'm a service provider working, I'm getting 20 clients, not one, and they can hold that person and negotiate better contracts with them. But then also the incentive, the state obviously they're making it impossible for us not to secure things because of the aid that we're receiving back. So yes.
So I just want to understand.
Sure.
Not everyone wants to go to college or is ready. So if someone wanted to learn building trades or culinary in high school,
Yes.
good.
We send kids there all the time. Yeah.
And all the kids know about this stuff.
What I understand from here is that some children know about it, but there's a push to expose children to the BOCES offerings. I can tell you that it's also a requirement under the Every Child Succeeds Act that districts do make children aware. So this can happen a couple of ways. So, for example, our counselors could invite the BOCES to come here and talk to every sophomore. They could get a bus and take a group of students, to the BOCES so that they can see all of the actual offerings, which I would recommend that they do, because they are impressive.
It is impressive.
And parents can actually go, take their son or daughter one evening, so they have an open house that also exposes children. And as I said, those are the equivalent of, college, credits, because you're getting out of there, with
be licensed.
a license.
Like a hairdresser, you can take cosmetology.
I just don't
Yeah.
know, as parents,
Yeah.
that we're sort of made that familiar
Right.
to the student body.
I think a lot of parents, may not or may not know, and I also think there's, an unfortunate stereotype associated with, children going to a career and technical education, vocational education program, and that's historical. It isn't us. It's there are many places where that's an unfortunate stereotype. one of the things that, and fortunately I was able to go on just a mini tour at the Southern Westchester BOCES. They have an actual like EMT truck that is open in the back, so it's half of the truck. So the children can go in who are enrolled in that program and learn all the components of that, along with mannequins that actually, where their chests, raised. So these are sort of very sophisticated tools for children. When they come out of that, they can become an EMT.
Well, even Valerie,
That's quite impressive.
but there are definitely kids, even like it is for kids who wouldn't go to college, but there are kids that I was saying I had known personally that were interested in potentially thinking about either they were either going to be an engineer or they're going to be a chef, and they weren't sure. So they knew of the program and they went, because it's a half-a-day program. You're still doing your core academics.
You have to
in the
come
morning.
back,
You
to the
come
high
back.
school.
It's just like it's almost like taking some electives. And then there are kids who went through that program and then decided to go on to the culinary, or and again, you were getting like world-class training. I mean, it's pretty incredible what they have there.
It is.
And kids who sometimes do it to have a job so they can work through college,
Yeah.
put themselves through college. So
They're
there's-
smart if
yeah.
they do. I mean, I just think that's just really
Yeah.
smart to do that. And I would tell any student that it's an opportunity while you are still in your high school, so you're not paying for it, and you're getting this high quality education. Whether it's at Southern Westchester BOCES or Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES, because we work with those two most frequently. Students who are also taking lots of APs are now trending in that direction. I read that maybe a couple of months ago in Education Week, that's sort of the trend, is because the students who are inclined more towards taking more of a stronger academic sort of pathway, or taking a stronger academic pathway, are finding that they want to be able to apply the skills. They want to be able to use to develop a sense of like, so what does it matter that I know these? I have this knowledge of this content if I can't apply it. And so all of the things there that would help children to do that are there. And so so that's actually a pretty brilliant strategy, if I should say so, for students who, but to look at it as that's only for students who are not going to college is quite a misnomer.
So that, again, that's just an example of things that we do participate in and maybe need to, like Valerie said, maybe different ways we can even highlight some of those wonderful programs that they do have available to us. And they just provide it's kind of comical because it's like almost anything that you can imagine. For a lot of those things you can kind of get through BOCES, which is, what we really rely and we need, and it's definitely helpful to us in terms of managing
on
costs.
so many levels.
This is just a very simple, because it was highlighted on the screen, and it is a separate aid category that the state puts together, and these are our per pupil allocations that we receive, and again, this is from the state of New York, and this is what they give us each year, which they will directly, as long as we spend the money, they don't give it to you until you spend it. This is how much they give us each year for each of these categories. They, per child enrolled in our district, this is how much we receive. And the way it works is that we have to demonstrate that we've in fact spent the money on hardware, technology, software. You can see the breakdown, library materials, and textbooks. And when we submit that through our reporting process that we do at the end of our fiscal year, and and we receive up to the maximum of our enrollment times those figures, and then as long as we've spent it. If we underspend it, we only get back what we've actually laid out. So that's actually very good, because again, this is dollar for dollar what we get back. So obviously, as much as sometimes it may seem like, why do you spend money on textbooks and things like that, we want to spend what we're going to be allocated, because we're going to get that money fully back from the state. This is just a little graphic that really just shows in terms of what we've been budgeting on a year-to-year. I think we try to budget as conservatively as possible. And you'll see that we trend getting a little bit more in our actual, and that's purposeful, because there are things, as I mentioned before, that are expense-driven aids, and some of those things, if we end up spending a little bit less, we're not going to receive that full aid that we are anticipating getting. So typically, we try to keep it as close to what we think we're going to receive, but the good news is that that's also part of our strategy, that we try to be as conservative in projecting our state revenues, and then we've been receiving a few $100,000 more. And again, that goes back to where, if we have some of those extra funds, how we replenish our reserves. Okay, so the tax cap, I feel like we talk about this a lot, but it seems as though it's here to stay. It just got extended.
Signed into law the
Signed
same
into
year
law,
that the
yeah.
TRS reserve was signed in.
Yeah, exactly. So the tax cap, and I think we probably know as tax for just living in the state of New York, it is very popular because what it does mean, in some ways, it limits the ability, or kind of put some kind of restrictions on how much schools and municipalities and the state, they kind of given themselves a state-imposed tax cap, although they don't have to abide by it. But so this was passed into law in 2011, and the law places a restriction on how school districts and municipalities can increase their tax levies, and if we exceed what the tax cap is in a given year, in order for it to be successful, we need at least 60% of our voters to approve it. The first implementation of it was the 12-13 school year. And again, this isn't our tax cap error. Since the implementation of that, we've been about an average of 2.7% each year. Our levy has been raised. And that's not budget to budget, that's our levy, which is, actually, that means our budget to budget for the most part has been less than that, because the levy is a portion of your total budget. And just to kind of go, the tax cap, what's kind of confusing about it is a lot of people just think it's like, oh, 2%, and it really isn't, because it has, there have been years that it's based upon a formula, and some of it is based upon CPI, and some of it is based upon your own individual factors in the district. So there's times we've been tax cap compliant and we've been less than 1%, and there's times we've been tax cap compliant and we've been at 4% or 4.5%, because there's other factors in there that's allowing us to go above whatever, it is, and it varies from district to district, and I think that's where there are pieces of that formula that are individualized to like how your spending is, and there's exclusions and things. So I think sometimes sometimes it can be somewhat confusing, because I think it seemed as though when it was signed into law, most people thought it was this kind of like hard 2%. And actually it would be sometimes better, because sometimes their first few years it was below 2%. So, you'll see that most districts, that there is, we can be at, I think even last year, I know Dobbs Ferry and Hastings, we were a few percentage points off from each other, and it varies wildly from district to district because of the other factors that we'll speak to on a following slide. But just to give you a sense, in 18-19, most districts had tax caps resulting in levies higher than 3%. So again, similar to Hastings, they had other increases that were in the allowable cap factor, and all districts, for the most part, received approval, all who were under the tax cap, and there was Mamaroneck actually has had 2 years that they've overridden the cap, 2 years in a row, and they might do it a third. So, yeah.
And I was in one of those districts, and it was an increase in revenue. So a natural gas installation was built in the school district, and that generated that particular year probably about $1.3 million coming to the school district. That's unheard of. And that amount of money then made the tax levy 4.13%, which, we were certainly, very worried about, messaging that to the community. Like, what did that mean? Does that mean my taxes are going to go up that amount? No, it meant that if the school, that the 4.3 was the allowable amount that the district could collect. And there was no way that the district was going to leave that amount of money on the table to go back and be distributed by, the county, the town. So collecting all of that meant that, that was additional revenue that really resulted in the end somewhere in the neighborhood of probably about 20 new positions. And as I said, that's really unheard of. But that is the other end, when there's an entity that comes into the school district and brings that amount of revenue. Every year that it's there, it'll be that amount of revenue that will be collected, and therefore that amount coming to the school district. I wish that would happen here, but...
Well, we didn't have an entity, but we had a homeowner that actually, similarly, that's where the last 2 years, our increase in our levy was solely based upon an individual's property. And that property actually did add like $1 million to our levy, so that was the same idea. Like, it wasn't as though that equally hit people across the board. Like, for some people, it may have appeared on the levy line to be 4%, but the actual tax rate people were paying may have only been a 0.5%, because that other money was like new money coming in. So sometimes it's a bit confusing, because you may be saying we're tax cap compliant because our levy's going up 4%, but your individual tax bill based upon that levy may only go up a 0.5%, or even sometimes flat, depending upon other factors in that levy. But again, it's critically important, because I think in terms of many people thinking it should be this 2% number, where there's a bunch of other things that go into your ability to raise that, and why you would want to do that as well.
Exactly.
So again, this is, do you want to walk through this, Valerie?
Sure. Before the tax cap, we always have to consider, this notion of what programs, we are dedicated to and committed to make sure that we're always able to offer those. We want to make sure that that's a major part, before the tax cap. That was not something that we necessarily had to worry about. I mean, we were always able to, if there were costs that went up that, associated with, with the cost of sort of, running a school district, that really wasn't something that we worried about. In those, before the tax cap, I mean, there were, in those years, there were probably, it wasn't uncommon for there to be an 8% or 10%, 12, 13%, and that any cost, of doing business was, passed on to the taxpayer. And that, that certainly is not the case, but that certainly is what, what was, the landscape before the tax cap. Law. Expenditures are allocated, again, that was not, not an issue associated with, that districts had to think a lot about or be worried about. And the levy, is absolutely necessary at that time to support those educational programs as it was deemed necessary by the school districts. And that was before the tax cap.
So revenues, it's in the past, it was always like whatever your expenditures were, that's what dictated your revenue. We start with the revenue numbers back into our expenditures, and that's the shift, because you're now locked into a number where before you would just develop your expenditures. And to Valerie's point, I know the first lot of years I worked here, it wasn't unusual for those numbers to be in the double digits, and there was no thought about it. Just was an expenditure-driven budget. And it's interesting, because it kind of makes sense that it should be, but now everything is coming from backing into a revenue number that is locked in at a certain number, and then seeing what your expenses are, and then seeing what you'll have to shave off to fit into that number, which is a very different way to construct a budget. It is kind of an opposite thought process.
It is, and so it's not about the needs necessarily of changing needs of your student population. So another, which I actually think is a really important mandate, is this notion of creating the least restrictive learning environment for students. That's really, really, really important. However, that means then that districts have to find ways to, support children in environments that, may mean that you do need additional staff, used differently in the district to ensure that children get to stay in their home districts rather than, going outward. It means that districts have to ensure that we provide professional learning for different people to work in environments where they're not, they're working in ways where children are developing more independence, especially if they're receiving mandated services. We, don't necessarily know, if we're going to get a certain child in who might, be speaking in another language other than English that might need, specialized services, that we can't say, we're going to do it, it doesn't matter, that's the right thing to do. We still have to do that, but we're not getting any additional resources necessarily to really help offset those types of decisions. So it really does put a district, in a pinch. And so, as we mentioned earlier, without being able to count on any additional revenues generated by any businesses that may be moving into to Hastings, we have to, we're going to be at a place where we have to make some decisions, about, well, so yes, we believe in lots of great programs and lots of different offerings for children, but how do we pay for it? How do we pay for those things? So those are the sort of choices. At the same time, that there are lots of other things happening. This notion of being very aware of cybersecurity and protection of personally identifiable information. All of that those are costs associated with that. We have to pay for the consultant who came in and offered the training for us. So those are real expenses, and all kinds of other things that we have to do to ensure, that we have a redundant, a cyber line that runs to us. And so if ever there's any kind of accident, where a utility or an entity severs that fiber, that wire that runs underground, that's the basis of us having lights and cameras and, the toilets flushing, we have to pay for that. So those are the kinds of things that, that are really, pressures on school districts that, we absolutely worry a great deal about. We had a CPI.
There is another, there's more beyond this.
I hope this didn't die on us.
Yeah.
Let me just see.
Yeah. Again, this is just part, and again, this will be more discussed when we get into the full budget, but just in terms of the tax cap calculation, and when we were talking about growth factors, it was what Valerie and I were alluding to. Tax-based growth factors, similar to her experience in her previous district, where you have something that comes in that expands your growth of your taxes. And that is a factor that is counted into the calculation, and that's why districts would in fact have a tax cap calculation that exceeds like in other districts, because this is individualized. What it really does is it measures the brick and mortar, new construction, and or significant existing additions to existing properties, which increases the size of the tax base. Hastings actually, not only for this one particular property that put the majority of new expanded our brick and mortar, but anytime when your neighbors or people are expanding on their houses, that again, it helps increase the overall assessment of the town, which again drives kind of the tax cap growth factor for us. Again, allowable growth factor CPI, this is another piece of the tax cap calculation, and this one is the same for everybody. This is the number, and it is based upon the consumer price index for the 12 months leading up to the time we're developing our budget. And we do know, it's trending right now at above 2%, but this is where it is problematic for the district. So, if gas prices and different natural resources are, and we know that CPI, although it has been fairly low the last few years, it actually has trended above 2%. So, we're capped at that 2%, even if our expenses for our heating our buildings and what we pay for gas and all different utility costs that are driven on CPI, actually they exceed CPI, but we are capped at that amount. So as we're creating our budget, it's like this idea that everything's going up by 2%, which is not the case. So that means in order to stay within that, we're typically like if we have an area that's going up by health insurance by 5%, we have to then look for decreases to kind of, even those increases out. So it can never be greater than 2%, and it can never be less than 0. Well, which is, I guess, some good news, but. Again, this is just another piece of the tax cap, and again, different things. So because the state recognizes that districts will again go and have bonds and have different debt that they decide as a conscious decision to take on, they do allow that to work outside the formula. So in other words, if you have no debt in one year, but the following year you have $400,000 worth of a debt payment, they do allow you to add that back after the calculation runs, because the idea would be if it was needing to be taken, it would be it's something that the district understood that they were going to be issuing additional tax dollars to support. And that's why it is actually extremely important, I think, more so than ever, to be really thoughtful of not that we're going to be constantly issuing bonds, but just kind of think about how we want to be strategic in borrowing money to do capital work for two reasons. We get the aid back, which we spoke about earlier, and secondly, it is an exclusion outside of the tax cap. So there are times, although things come up and you always have to have a certain amount of money in your maintenance budget to address things that have to be taken care of within a 12 to 18 month period. In thinking and working, together with the board and the planning of that, it's important for us to really be strategic because of the fact also those are exclusions outside the tax cap where your maintenance budget is not. So it's important to kind of group things and sometimes issue debt from time to time because then you're allowed to take that outside of the tax cap. So I think that is really made districts really much more heightened awareness about how important it is to plan for those. And I think even because that districts have issued maybe not like huge amounts of debt, but they may wait and do $2 and $3 million bonds because they know that runs outside the formula, like in terms of the overall like budgeting process. So that's something that we're going to be like really trying to get a strong plan around as well. And again, these are other exclusions. If we had a huge a judgment on a tax cert, this would not happen to us because it would need to be like, one would have to exceed like this huge amount. It has to be a portion of your levy, which in this case would be $3 million. That will not happen to us. And then if the ERS or TRS exceeds a 2%, 2% meaning 2 basis point percent, not what that actually equates to, in a given year, anything up and above that you could exclude from the tax cap. That happened once, and we actually don't care about the exclusion. We don't want it to go up that much more. So we hope that doesn't happen because that, even though you get a little bit of an exclusion, the 2% it goes up in the first is a lot harder to deal with. Yeah. So these are all kind of components of that. This kind of just shows you, and again, this speaks to how we spoke about how there are some years there where your tax cap can actually be lower than 2% and kind of where we've been trending. And you can see here in the 18-19 school year and 19-20 where this has to do again with our levy, not actually what a person's tax bill went up. It's speaking directly to our levy. Because in that same year where we had a 6.29% tax growth base factor, the resulting tax rate was less than 1% because again it was being driven on an individual homeowner who
was contributing to that
to the levy individually. That didn't exist before. It wasn't a replacement. It was like his property coming online that drove 18-19 and 19-20. The majority of that growth was, I think actually in 18-19, believe it or not, we had the largest growth factor, the first or the second largest growth factor in the state as a percentage of our levy. Because I actually called and I was like, is this correct? Because it was so, it was to think that our levy was growing higher than anybody's in the state in terms of percentage, not dollar amount. So, and in fact, it was correct. And again, to Valerie's point, it was new money onto the levy that we wanted to take because at the same time we knew that the resulting tax rate would be fairly we wanted to keep it as close as flat as possible, but this was also an opportunity where there were some needs in the district that by having this additional funding, it was kind of our one opportunity to either expand some of those needs or take care of them at that time, similar to what she had done in her previous district. We had some psychologists in different positions, and this, had that not come through, we would not have
been able to do
that.
it. And you get that one shot.
You get the one shot, and then the money
take
goes
it
away. If you don't increase your levy that year, like you're unable to get your levy up for that following year. So there is some strategy to when those times are, and you have to be thoughtful about how you want to take those increases in a given year.
And when we saw that our levy that last year was going up, actually it's this year 4.13%. Since it hadn't happened before, the business official called and asked, so is this real? I mean, is he reading this correctly that the district is getting that amount, right? You call. And we learned there were a couple of upstate districts that did have some fairly significant tax-based growth factors, and it was because new revenue was coming onto the tax rolls that hadn't existed the previous year. And, whatever it was, there were, in some cases it was a car dealership and a Walmart or something like that, fairly significant moving in which, brings a lot of tax revenue with, along, with its sort of new existence, plus lots of places for people to spend money. So that's that is an interesting, sort of anomaly or occurrence, but, it does happen. One more, it's freezing on us.
Okay, and then again, this is just to touch on some of the other revenues. So again, this is not listing every single one, but these are the larger categories. So this is where our other revenues come when not from local sources and not from the state. The good thing is the interest income with the interest rates, although they're still not that high, they're much higher than they were a few years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, we only were able to generate about $40,000 in interest income. With the increase in the interest rates, we are scheduled to receive about $200,000 this year of interest income for just the money as it sits in our bank accounts waiting to be spent. That's where we generate those funds, and we are really strategic in trying to hold money and how we pay things to try to maximize the interest that we do earn. Tuitions, that's both parental placements into the district. The majority of that money is coming from when other districts place their students here. That's the, and again, that fluctuates anywhere from some years $250,000 and other years, a few years ago, $800,000. So we're comfortable. I think we had budgeted $475, but we probably will exceed that projection this year. And again, this is something, as much as it's great from year to year, some of it is based upon when other districts place their children here. And even if they think we have the best program, sometimes students move out of district. So we have to be always very cautious because we do have to balance our budget, and we don't want to overestimate that number, because if someone were to pull back, it would be a problem.
It would be a
us.
huge
Yeah.
problem for us, and and obviously, to bring in new tuition from students, for example, who were educated in their home districts into a program here, for example. So we create a particular kind of special education program. That does require that, sometimes we have to spend money to get money. So
Right.
we have to make sure we have the appropriate staffing, the appropriate room, maybe sometimes there's furnishings and other kinds of things that are really essential in order for those programs to be successful. And then for the students to stay there, especially if those programs are really suitable for them. And we don't want that, anyone to leave because we don't have a program that's properly built. So that's going on behind the scenes as well. To keep our own children in the district who may need services that could potentially lead to them being placed in another district, but at the same time we want to also attract families who want to put their children in our programs, meaning the school districts that want to put their children in our school district. But we are not, that money is not money that we can say, oh, well, let's put that into reserve.
Yeah.
It operates very differently with regards to whether or not you actually have it, because it could be, as Maureen said, a child moving out of the district, and let's say that part of that 475, maybe 900,000 was associated with that child in terms of that tuition. So that's why you have to be, very, very, strategic about, what happens to that amount of money.
And the reason, part of the out-of-district tuitions, it's more about, we build programs here for our own students. We're not a private school trying to build, and of course, it helps when other districts, and similarly, when we can do something really well, they can, and we belong to different types of consortium agreements to try to create, an expertise in one program, but there are costs associated with it. So it is something you have to be very mindful of and really understand, because we are collecting tuition, but we're also increasing our expenditure line, and it's not done for the motivation of attracting
Tuition.
students. We do it for our own students first, and then of course once we have a program, then we open up our doors, and that's how that. But again, those numbers, we have some years, it works out well. We sometimes receive more funds, but again, we're very, we try to be as conservative and realistic as possible when we think about what that number may be 18 months in advance of when it actually happens. Sales tax, again, this has been great for Hastings. Up until a few years ago, we were only receiving about $400,000. It's a nice increase in terms of when you think about real dollars over what we were receiving. It's a nice amount, and it's going to be very helpful as we develop our budget next year as well. borderline properties, those are people who are either living in Dobbs Ferry or Yonkers, who part of their property is in Hastings, and their children attend here, and we bill those other districts back for those funds. E-rate and refunds. The federal government has a program in which for things such as technology, wiring, and different certain expenditures, if we apply through different grant processes, we get money back on those. So that reflects when we're purposeful in how we decide to do things so that we can maximize our aid. So when we have a project coming up, we try to align it with different programs that the federal government is offering refunds on those projects. So that's another source of revenue for us.
And that concludes today's Part 2 Budget 101 workshop. We have one left on January 21st. We're going to talk about contractual and supplies, as well as BOCES services, again, which we hit upon, but we'll get into some detail about what that looks like. Are there any questions? Ready for the quiz? No.
It's a take-home.
It's a take-home, exactly. A take-home that you could keep at home, right?
And again,
So
this
thank
is
you.
very like this is just to kind of give you a sense. So as when we get into the full budget, it'll give you, okay, like state aid, I understand how that works. It'll start to come together even better when we get into our real budget series. So right now we're just trying to give you just different kind of how all these different things work. But then once you see our proposals for next year, you'll have kind of a better understanding of how the restrictions are and how we come to coming to our budget process and what parameters we have as we start that process.
And the belief system and supporting the values
Yes.
of the community
Yep.
are a major part of that, given all of these restrictions and constraints. There's still a belief about, what the community values in our school districts and what we're going to do to the best of our ability with, presenting a budget to the Board of Education to maintain that.
Can you just review quickly, why is it beneficial to do these bonds?
Sure.
You said there were, first of all, you get some of the funds back if you do certain projects in alignment with the state. So if you're able to just do it at the time you get the state funds, that's helpful. And then you mentioned something about the department being outside the tax cap
Yeah.
for certain.
Right. So because the state recognizes if in fact the public supports a capital bond tax cap, if they're supporting a capital bond, whatever cost is associated with the debt for that bond, they allow you to add that in so let's just say it's $500,000 in a given year. After you figure out what your tax cap limit is for that year, that number gets added to the bottom, because the idea behind it is it's not always going to be a recurring expense. So it's something that you have to pay for the life of that debt. But the idea behind it also is the tax cap is limiting to your year-to-year operational expenses. This is kind of a special expense that gets added on. If we just handle our maintenance solely every year out of our maintenance budget, and we try to handle it there, we lose two opportunities. I mean, on certain things, it has to be that way, because there's things that are going to come up, and we don't have the luxury of planning votes and things like that. And it takes time to do all that, about a year and a half time. But it doesn't allow for those expenses to ever get reimbursed. You get no aid back on them. So if every year you're spending $200,000 or $300,000 on maintenance, or exceeding probably $200,000, there is a point that you're like, wow, we could have got money back on it. Should we be thinking not necessarily to do $18 million bonds, but you will see some districts every few years will issue a $2 million bond for that reason. They'll hold off on things out of their operational budget, then they'll issue that bond, just to kind of get a bunch of things done, and also to the benefit of getting the money back from the state, and then also the added benefit of that not needing to then reduce, when you're looking at the tax cap calculation, that actually takes money out of the pot that could affect programs. Like then, well, if we have to spend $200,000 or so, above $200,000, because you'll always have some, then you'll have to start making cuts in other areas, because the building you have to maintain. I mean, we have to. It's not, some of it, yes, is we like things to work a certain way, but there's a certain amount of things you have money set aside to do that. And honestly, again, that's one of the examples like BOCES that the state, they do make it very attractive. It's just that we'll have to, have a very thoughtful conversation and planning of if we are thinking of going in that direction. And again, it helps us with that tax cap as well, so.
You mean a capital bond?
The capital bond, yeah, so just in terms of, what happened with, not happened, but we were planning on doing our last bond around the time when the first, around 2007, and then of course we held off for many years. So we actually kind of, many districts will issue bonds every 3 to 4 years, like just, whatever they need, and they don't wait for them to build up. They'll do some do, but some will just issue like 10 million every so many years. I'm thinking after this bond, we're going to be in a much better place in terms of our overall facilities between the last two, but as we look at the work that we may have, there's probably some reason to kind of get back on those type of maintenance schedules and say, let's try to do 3 or 4 million. Not just, if you don't have to, you wouldn't of course do it, but if we have some things, let's be strategic in planning those for both the aid reasons and then also for the purposes of the tax cap.
And it's also, more respectful to the taxpayers rather than having this big bond, somewhere along the way. And, the community gets whiplash from that. Yeah. When we know, and Maureen and Joe have done a great job of looking at our sort of facilities plan, a long-term facilities plan where we know, what the expiration date is for certain things that are going to require some attention, and staying on top of that and making that happen. And that's really a more, respectful strategy, in my opinion, having seen the kinds of things that districts have done over the last, let's say 5 or 10 years. It makes a big difference because it's coming. It's coming. You can do it. You can explain that much more easily to the taxpayer. We need these things, and show, and with all the photographic evidence and reports from, the various people to, to confirm that, that's a $6 million or $10 million, not even 10, but 5, 6, 3, as Maureen said, those things are really helpful because you take care of those things and they don't sort of pile up over time to something very, very large. That sometimes may happen, and there are school districts that are on they're on a constant sort of steady sort of process of construction bonds because that's just their philosophy of dealing with it. It's a much larger school district, but that's what happens, and they have buildings that are fairly old, and they have to keep those buildings in good shape, and because again that's where you have you lose all the dollars spent on heating if it goes out the windows, right? Or there's, places that you need to sort of strengthen and, have, more efficient windows. So you have to pay for those things. And then in the end, it also helps, the cost with regards to heating and so forth.
Yeah, that's true. Not to keep belaboring the point, but there are things you can do in terms of capital bonds. Last year, although it wasn't through a bond, we did a lighting project, and actually we're already seeing the benefit of that. We've changed to LED lighting. So you have a capital investment on one end, but again, if you then end up having good operational savings, we've done that before, and I could sit here and talk for the next 3 hours, but we've done projects which are called energy efficient projects that there was like a 1.5 million, but then we ended up saving operationally like a few $100,000 a year just in energy costs, right? Because we changed out a lot of windows, doors, and even though you see it on your house, on buildings of this size, you do see a large impact. So I think it just, again, just speaks to, I think everything is planning and being, like Valerie said, just making sure there's a good plan in front of taxpayers and making sure that we have things like that so that we can kind of get ahead of it so it doesn't feel that we're always, getting hit with a large bond. But that being said, even with our last bond, and I know it was a lot, but even, I think we're still either, we were at one point either the second or third out of Putnam and Westchester districts, the least amount of debt. And that's still, we still have, compared to our counterparts, we have, they're actually issuing another bond out for more, so they're, our indebtedness, which is the total amount we owe, in bonds, is a quarter of, size school districts. So I know it feels like a lot when we're going out, but we do try, we're very careful and mindful of what we're doing, and we do as much as we can in-house, but there are times that it may make some sense if we know we have a couple $1 million to think about going to bond. And I'll leave it at that.
So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure, and get home safely. You'll need a canoe, I think.
Oh, God.